Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy History Channel. I'm glad you found your way here, because tonight we'll be drifting far back through time, to a land full of mystery and wonder that even the ancients considered ancient. A kingdom of powerful gods and immortal pharaohs, of forgotten cities and sacred texts. A place where the sun brought life, the dead walked among the stars, and every grain of sand told a story. Wherever you are now, let this be your moment to let go. Let your thoughts soften, the day melt away, and allow your mind to sink gently into the stillness of the past. Tonight, we'll wander among myths and mummies, beneath hidden tombs and giant obelisks. We'll meet crocodile gods, queens who defied history, and builders who did the impossible. Some of these facts may surprise you. Others may drift past like fragments from a dream. If this kind of peaceful wonder brings you calm or stirs your curiosity, I'd be honored if you'd like and subscribe. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy traveler at a time. But for now, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let this sleepy journey into ancient Egypt begin. Egypt lasted so long that even they thought of it as ancient themselves. It's strange to think, but Cleopatra lived closer to our time than to the builders of the Great Pyramid. She ruled in the 1st century BCE during the final breath of ancient Egypt. By then, the pyramids were already over 2,000 years old. In fact, the civilization we call ancient Egypt lasted for more than 3,000 years, longer than most of recorded history since. It passed through hundreds of pharaohs, dozens of dynasties, and countless rises and falls. The same sacred river flowed past every age. The same stars turned slowly over every temple. Time in Egypt didn't just pass, it settled, layer by layer, like sediment in the Nile. So when we think of Egypt, we're not looking at a single moment. We're gazing into a slow-burning miracle of continuity, older than memory, and still not fully understood. The Nile didn't just flood, it told time. Each year, like clockwork, the Nile rose. In late summer, the waters swelled from far-off rains, spilling over the riverbanks and turning desert into living soil. To the Egyptians, this flood wasn't a natural disaster, it was a gift from the gods, the breath of the earth itself. They built their entire calendar around it. Their new year began not in winter, but with the rising of the river. The stars foretold its coming, especially Sirius, the bright one whose reappearance marked the flood's approach. Life depended on the Nile's rhythm, planting, harvesting, building, praying. Even their myths echoed the cycle of death, burial, rebirth. The river didn't just water the fields, it shaped how they thought about time, eternity, and the thin, sacred line between life and death. Pharaohs were gods, but still had to earn their place in the afterlife. To rule Egypt was to stand between heaven and earth. The pharaoh was not just a king, he was Horus made flesh, the living god. Statues showed him with divine symbols, the crook and flail, the cobra crown, the sacred beard. His word was law, his image sacred. And yet, even gods had to be judged. In the afterlife, the pharaoh's heart would still be weighed, just like any farmer or servant, against the feather of truth. If his heart was heavy with lies or cruelty, it would be devoured by a waiting beast, and his soul would vanish forever. Power in this life was not enough. The pharaoh still had to live rightly, honor the gods, and walk gently with truth. In Egypt, even divinity had rules, and no one was above the final judgment. The Great Pyramid was the tallest thing on Earth for nearly 4,000 years. Rising from the desert at Giza, the Great Pyramid of Khufu once stood gleaming white under the Egyptian sun. Covered in polished limestone, it reflected light like a jewel. At nearly 500 feet tall, it held the record as the tallest human-made structure on Earth for almost 4,000 years, from around 2560 BCE until the spires of Cain. Medieval Europe. No cranes, no iron tools, no advanced machinery, just thousands of workers, brilliant planning, and raw determination. Even today, we don't fully understand how it was built. Its corners align almost perfectly with the cardinal points. Its base is nearly level to within fractions of an inch. To stand near it is to feel something ancient stir, not just a sense of size, but of intention, silence, and awe. It wasn't just a tomb. It was a message to time itself. The Sphinx might predate the pyramids, and we still don't know its original face. The Great Sphinx of Giza gazes east, older than memory, and carved from a single massive stone. Its body is a lion, a guardian of sacred places, but its human face remains a mystery. For centuries, sand covered it up to the neck. Some scholars believe it may predate the pyramids, possibly built by an earlier pharaoh or even a forgotten civilization. Others think its head was recarved, its proportions strangely small for the rest of the body. Who it once resembled, we may never know. Was it Khafre? Gedifer? Or someone lost to time? Wind and sand have worn it down, but the expression remains calm, enigmatic, watchful. The Sphinx does not answer questions. It invites them. It waits. And it endures. Hieroglyphs weren't just writing, they were considered alive. In ancient Egypt, writing wasn't just a tool. It was a sacred act, a way to give life to thought. Each hieroglyph, whether a bird, an eye, or a twisted rope, carried more than sound or meaning. It carried power. Some symbols were believed so potent that scribes avoided carving them in full, for fear they might come alive. Images of snakes or dangerous animals were sometimes drawn broken or incomplete, just to keep them dormant. Priests spoke spells to awaken carved texts, believing the words could act in the world beyond the page. Tombs weren't decorated for beauty, they were inscribed to function. Words gave the dead food, spells, protection, memory. In Egypt, writing was a form of magic, and to read the old symbols is to listen, even now, to voices that once believed they could echo through eternity. The path to becoming a mummy was long, gruesome, and deeply sacred. To become a mummy in ancient Egypt was not a quick or simple act. It was a 70-day ritual filled with chants, ointments, spices, and silence. First came purification, the washing of the body with sacred water. Then the organs were removed, stomach, lungs, liver, and intestines, each placed in its own protected jar. The brain was pulled out through the nose, discarded, considered useless. The heart, believed to be the seat of the soul, was carefully left in place, or sometimes hidden for weighing in the afterlife. The body was then dried with natrum, a salt that drew out every drop of moisture. After weeks of waiting, it was wrapped in linen, layer upon layer, often with amulets tucked between folds. Every step had a spell. Every movement had meaning. Death wasn't the end, it was a transformation. And mummification was the sacred craft of making someone eternal. Ancient Egyptian doctors could set bones, stitch wounds, and even treat depression. The medicine of ancient Egypt wasn't all spells and prayers. It was surprisingly advanced. Medical papyri describe how to set broken bones with wooden splints, how to clean and stitch wounds, and how to examine the pulse to diagnose illness. They used honey as an antiseptic, and willow bark, which contains the same compound as aspirin, to relieve pain. There were treatments for everything from toothaches to digestive trouble to nightmares. And even emotional suffering had remedies. Ancient texts mention spells and herbal mixtures for sorrow, restlessness, and melancholy. The line between doctor and priest was thin, but both believed that healing came from balance of body, spirit, and the invisible forces of the world. In a land ruled by gods, medicine was both science and sacred act. Killing a cat, even by accident, could get you executed. In ancient Egypt, cats weren't just pets. They were guardians, symbols of grace, and earthly extensions of divine beings. The goddess Bastet, with her feline face and lioness past, was worshipped as a protector of homes, mothers, and the soul. Cats were beloved, pampered, and protected by law. So much so that to kill one, even by mistake, was a capital crime. Greek visitors wrote of entire crowds erupting in rage at the harm of a single cat. Families mummified their cats, buried them in miniature sarcophagi, and shaved their eyebrows in mourning. Some temples kept dozens of sacred cats in residence, fed with offerings and prayers. They hunted snakes, watched over children, and curled beside the dead. To live in ancient Egypt was to share your world with creatures both mysterious and divine. Temples weren't for people, they were houses where gods actually lived. Step inside an ancient Egyptian temple, and you weren't entering a church. You were crossing into a realm built not for humans, but for gods. Every chamber, corridor, and courtyard followed a sacred blueprint, drawing you deeper toward the holiest space, the inner sanctuary. There, hidden from the public, sat the god statue. It was washed, dressed, anointed, and fed daily by priests. Offerings were laid before it. Incense was burned to invite its presence. The outer courtyards were public only during festivals. Most Egyptians never saw the god's image, only the rituals from afar. The temple itself was seen as a cosmic model, its walls symbolizing the edges of the world, its roof the night sky dotted with stars. To walk its halls was to walk the architecture of creation. In Egypt, gods were not distant. They had homes, and those homes still stand. The journey to the afterlife included battles, beasts, and a final judgment. Dying in Egypt was not the end. It was the beginning of a long and perilous voyage. The soul passed through caverns and gates, deserts and rivers, shadowed by demons and watched by gods. It had to name secret passwords, face serpents, answer riddles. At each stage, spells from the Book of the Dead gave guidance, like a cosmic map. And finally, the soul reached the hall of two truths, where its heart was weighed against a feather. If the heart was light and pure, the soul passed on to eternal paradise. If heavy with sin, it was devoured by Amit, a creature part lion, part crocodile, part hippopotamus. No second chances. The end was total. So the dead were buried with everything they might need: food, tools, songs, prayers, to survive that hidden world. In Egypt, death wasn't feared, but it had to be prepared for. Gods wore animal heads to reveal the hidden forces behind the visible world. To the ancient Egyptians, gods weren't limited to human forms. They wore the heads of falcons, caps, crocodiles, jackals, each shape holding a layer of meaning. Horus had the head of a falcon, symbolizing the sky and the sharp gaze of kingship. Anubis bore a jackal's head, watching over cemeteries where real jackals roamed. Sobek took the form of a crocodile, fierce and protective, rising from the Nile's depths. These weren't costumes, they were truths. The animal forms showed how each god moved through nature, not as rulers above it, but as forces within it. And their images reminded humans to see the world differently, not as random, but as alive with presence. In Egypt, to see a hawk circle the sun or a cat curl in the doorway was to glimpse something sacred peeking through the ordinary. The Book of the Dead wasn't a book, and it wasn't meant to be read by the living. Despite its name, the Book of the Dead wasn't a single book. It was a collection of spells, hymns, and instructions, tailored for each person, handwritten on papyrus or painted on tomb walls. And it wasn't for reading by torchlight. It was a guide for the soul, used after death to navigate the underworld. The dead needed to speak sacred words, no hidden names, and perform magical acts. The text told them how. Some versions had just a few spells. Others stretched on for meters. No two copies were exactly alike. The living prepared it, but never needed to open it again. It was tucked beside the body, whispered over, and left behind, a silent map through the invisible. Some tombs included board games for playing in the afterlife. Among the treasures buried in tombs, gold, statues, food, amulets, archaeologists often find something humble: board games. The most famous is Fascinate, a game of fate and movement played on a wooden grid. To us, it might look simple, but to the Egyptians, it mirrored the journey of the soul. Players moved tokens past hazards onto safe squares and into a final resting place of peace. Kings played it in life, and then again in eternity. Some boards were carved from ivory, others drawn on stone. Painted instructions appear beside them in tomb murals. In a realm filled with challenges, even gods played games. And the dead, wrapped in linen and silence, were sent with pieces in hand, ready to play one last time beneath the stars. Egyptians believed the brain was useless, but the heart contained your soul. In modern times, we see the brain as the seat of thought, emotion, identity. But to the ancient Egyptians, it was little more than filler, removed during mummification, discarded without ceremony. The heart, not the brain, held memory, morality, feeling, and truth. It was weighed in judgment. It was kept inside the body. It spoke on your behalf before the gods. Even amulets were shaped like tiny hearts, placed close to the real one to protect it. Without your heart, you couldn't be reborn. And if it was impure, you wouldn't return at all. To the Egyptians, wisdom didn't come from the head, but from the center of being. And the heart never lied. Papyrus scrolls were so durable, we still have them after 3,000 years. Long before parchment or paper, Egypt gave the world something remarkable: papyrus. Made from the tall reeds that lined the Nile, papyrus sheets were pressed, dried, and joined together into scrolls, light, flexible, and surprisingly tough. They recorded hymns, tax receipts, love poems, medical texts, and myths. Some were buried with the dead. Others lay forgotten in desert ruins. And many still survive. Despite the passage of centuries, despite insects, floods, and fire, these fragile pages remain legible. Some bear the fingerprints of their writers. Others are so well preserved, they could be read aloud today. In every brushstroke, you can feel a human hand, long gone, but still whispering. Gods could die, change shape, and even be born from their own tears. Egyptian gods were not fixed beings. They were fluid, mysterious, alive. One could be a lion one day, a man the next, and a wind by morning. Some died, only to rise again. Others gave birth to themselves, or cried so deeply that new gods sprang from their tears. Osiris was torn apart and resurrected. Ortum created the world by spitting light into the void. Sekhmet, goddess of war, once nearly destroyed humanity until she was tricked into drinking red beer and became Hathor, goddess of joy. The line between destruction and healing, wrath and love, was thin and shifting. In Egypt, the gods reflected the desert and the river, harsh, life-giving, ever-changing. The ANC wasn't just a symbol, it was a key to immortality. The ANC is one of the most recognizable symbols of ancient Egypt, a looped cross held by gods, painted on tombs, worn as jewelry. But it wasn't just decoration. The ANC meant life, not just earthly breath, but eternal existence. It was offered to the dead, to pharaohs, to the soul. Gods were often shown holding it near someone's nose, as if breathing life into them. It appeared on amulets, sarcophagi, and sacred architecture. Some believed it represented sunrise over the horizon. Others saw it as a divine nod. But all agreed the ANC was a promise. That life did not end. That something continued, glowing and golden, just beyond this world. Women could own property, run businesses, and even rule as pharaoh. In many ancient societies, women were little more than shadows. But in Egypt, they walked with rights. A woman could own land, inherit wealth, file lawsuits, and operate her own business. She could sign contracts without a husband and bequeath her goods as she saw fit. In tomb paintings and records, we see women as priestesses, musicians, scribes, and even doctors. And at the very top, rarely, but unmistakably, some ruled as pharaohs. Not as queens behind the throne, but as sovereigns in their own right. Their names, while fewer, still echo. Hatshepsut, Sobek-Neferu, Tusret. Power was not always equal. But in Egypt, a woman could be more than a wife or daughter. She could be a voice, a ruler, a presence carved in stone. Pharaohs wore fake beards, even the women. The beard in ancient Egypt wasn't about masculinity. It was about divinity. Pharaohs, male and female, wore stylized false beards, braided, curved at the tip, and often made of gold. These ceremonial beards linked them to Osiris, the god of the afterlife, who was always shown bearded. Even Hatshepsut, one of the few female pharaohs, appeared in statues with the same chin piece, along with the traditional kilt and crown. It wasn't disguise. It was sacred uniform. By donning it, the ruler became more than human. A bridge between earth and sky. A god walking among the living. In a land where appearances were ritual, even the beard became a spell. One of Egypt's most powerful pharaohs was a woman, and her name was almost erased. Hatshepsut ruled Egypt for over 20 years during a time of peace, prosperity, and monumental building. She led trade expeditions, restored temples, and raised some of the most elegant structures in the ancient world, including her cliffside temple at Deir el-Bahri. But after her death, someone tried to erase her. Her statues were smashed. Her name was chiseled from walls. Her memory, legally, was made to disappear. For centuries, she was nearly forgotten. Only in modern times did archaeologists piece her story back together. Her face emerged again from broken stone. Her deeds, once buried, now rise like columns from the sand. She was a king in all but name, and history couldn't keep her silent. Cleopatra ruled Egypt, but she was Greek by blood and Roman by fate. When Cleopatra VII became queen, she inherited more than a throne. She inherited a fractured, fading empire. Though she ruled Egypt, her family was Macedonian Greek, descended from Ptolemy, one of Alexander the Great's generals. She was the first in her line to speak Egyptian. Fluent in many languages, she was known for her intelligence, charm, and fierce political will. She formed alliances and romances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. And when it all collapsed, she took her own life rather than be paraded through Rome. Egypt fell to Rome just after her death. She was the last pharaoh. And in many ways, she didn't belong to any one culture, but to the space between them. Wigs weren't fashion statements. They were a shield against lice, heat, and class anxiety. In the Egyptian heat, many people shaved their heads entirely, practical and clean. But to go bare was to risk appearing poor. So wigs became a way to be both clean and respectable. They were often elaborate, curled, beaded, scented with oils. Some were made of human hair, others from plant fiber. Even children wore them for ceremonies. To appear in public without one, for the upper class, was unthinkable. And in the tombs, wigs were placed carefully beside the dead, so they'd remain dignified for eternity. In ancient Egypt, hair was identity, and the wig was a crown you could take on and off. Beer was considered safer than water, and children drank it too. The Nile brought life, but its water could be dangerous. So Egyptians turned to beer, not as a luxury, but as a daily drink. Brewed from barley and baked bread, this beer was thick, slightly sour, and low in alcohol. Laborers were paid in it. Priests offered it to the gods, and children drank it with meals. It was food, medicine, and ritual. Some tombs even show scenes of beer brewing, watched over by protective spirits. And at festivals, giant vats were prepared for joyful chaos. To drink beer was to be part of life's rhythm. To brew it was to imitate the gods. The poor wore sandals of palm fiber. The rich wore gold ones into the afterlife. In daily life, most Egyptians walked barefoot. But when they did wear sandals, the materials revealed everything. The poor had shoes made from woven palm fibers, lightweight, practical, and easily replaced. For wealthier citizens, leather was common. But the truly elite, especially royalty, commissioned sandals made of pure gold. These weren't for walking, they were for burial. Found in tombs beside linen wrappings and perfume jars, golden sandals were meant to carry the dead into eternity in style and status. Even the soles were sometimes engraved with enemies, so that the wearer could symbolically trample them forever. In life and in death, what you wore on your feet said who you were and where you hoped to go. The pyramid builders weren't slaves. They were skilled workers who lived in comfort. The long-standing image of slaves toiling under the lash has slowly crumbled under archaeology's careful hands. Evidence now shows that the builders of the Great Pyramids were paid laborers, craftsmen, stonecutters, and planners, many of whom lived in specially built workers' villages nearby. They ate well, bread, beer, beef, and fish. They received medical care, and their tombs show pride in their work. Some were even buried with honors near the pyramids they helped build. Constructing these monuments was a national project, part engineering, part devotion. These were not the nameless, suffering masses of myth. They were people with skills, lives, families, and stories still etched in limestone. The Egyptian calendar had 365 days, but the year ended in 5 unlucky ones. the Egyptians followed the sun. Their calendar had 12 months of 30 days, and at the end of the year, 5 extra days remained. These weren't just leftover time. They were special and strange. Called the epagomenal days, they were seen as outside the regular flow of time. Myth said the gods were born during this window: Osiris, Isis, Horus the Elder, Seth, and Nephthys. These days were both sacred and risky. Festivals were held, but so were protective rituals. Some considered them unlucky. Others stayed indoors. In this quiet pause between one year and the next, Egypt waited. Not in fear, but with reverence for the time that didn't belong anywhere. The Nile flowed backward compared to most rivers, and it shaped their entire worldview. The Nile flows from south to north, an unusual direction among great rivers. But for Egypt, this became a kind of compass. Upper Egypt was to the south, where the river begins. Lower Egypt was to the north, near the Mediterranean. Everything moved with the Nile. Boats floated downstream with the current and sailed upstream with the wind. Even the maps followed this orientation. Life followed water, and so did thought. The Nile became the spine of the kingdom, the lifeline of gods, the mirror of the Milky Way. It didn't just irrigate fields. It reoriented how the Egyptians saw space, direction, and destiny. Temples were aligned with the stars, so sunlight could pierce the inner sanctum on one sacred day. Egyptian temples weren't just built. They were aligned, precisely, with the heavens. Some were designed so that on one exact day each year, often the birthday of the god they honored, the rising sun would shine straight through their halls and illuminate the hidden sanctuary within. This wasn't coincidence. It was cosmic architecture. At Abu Simbel, the sun touches the statues inside only twice a year, the dates of Ramses II's birth and coronation. These moments transformed stone into theater, shadow into ritual. For a few minutes, the gods came alive in light. And then, just as precisely, they disappeared again into dusk. Ancient makeup didn't just beautify, it protected against disease and summoned divine protection. Egyptians lined their eyes with kohl, thick black pigment made from crushed minerals. To us, it looks like art or vanity, but for them, it was medicine and magic. Kohl helped reduce glare from the sun and repelled flies. It also contained lead-based compounds that strangely helped fight eye infections, stimulating the body's immune response. But more than that, the act of applying it was sacred. Eye makeup mimicked the eyes of Horus and Ra, gods of vision, protection, and cosmic order. Painting it on was a ritual, a shield, a prayer written in shadow on the skin. Scarab amulets weren't just jewelry, they were resurrection technology. To the ancient Egyptians, the scarab beetle wasn't just an insect. It was a symbol of rebirth, transformation, and the rising sun. Each morning, they believed, the god Khepri, in the form of a dung beetle, rolled the sun across the sky. Scarab amulets were worn for protection in life and packed into linen wrappings for the dead. Some were inscribed with prayers or names. Others were placed over the heart, sealed with spells to prevent it from speaking against its owner during judgment. These were more than trinkets. They were keys to resurrection, small, sacred machines meant to carry the soul through death and into the light. Crocodiles were so sacred that some were mummified in gold. To most Egyptians, the crocodile was a creature of terror, strong, silent, and swift. But it was also divine. The god Sobek, with his crocodile head, represented both the might of the Nile and the raw, untamed power of creation. Temples were built in his honor. Priests kept sacred crocodiles in pools, feeding them carefully and adorning them with jewels. When they died, these animals were mourned, wrapped in linen, and sometimes even mummified with gilded snouts and elaborate sarcophagi. What most of the world feared, Egypt worshipped. And in those deep temple pools, the line between animal and god rippled in silence. Most Egyptians lived on the thin strip between river and desert and left no ruins behind. When we think of Egypt, we picture grand temples and pyramids, but those were rare. The vast majority of Egyptians lived in simple homes made of mud brick, close to the Nile's edge, where water made farming possible. These bricks were sun-dried, not fired, and crumbled easily over time. Floods, winds, and centuries of reuse erased entire villages. So while tombs and temples endure in stone, the homes, markets, and laughter of daily life have mostly vanished. Egypt's ruins are silent, not because it was empty, but because the living left behind things too humble to survive the ages. Priests shaved their entire bodies to remain ritually pure, even their eyebrows. Cleanliness in ancient Egypt wasn't just hygiene, it was sacred. Temple priests bathed several times a day, wore fine white linen, and avoided certain foods to stay pure. But one of their most striking practices was shaving, not just their heads, but every inch of body hair. Even eyelashes and eyebrows were removed. This wasn't vanity. It was a ritual reset, removing any trace of the animal, the chaotic, or the worldly. In their silence, in their smoothness, the priests became empty vessels, fit to speak with the gods, to light incense, and to touch the sacred statues hidden deep inside stone awls. The ibis bird, sacred to Thoth, was often buried in mass tombs by the thousands. Thoth, god of wisdom, writing, and the moon, was often shown with the head of an ibis, a slender bird with a curved beak. These birds were sacred to him, and temples across Egypt kept them in large numbers. When they died, they were mummified, carefully wrapped and placed in dedicated catacombs. Some burial chambers hold thousands of ibis mummies, stacked in niches like scrolls in a library. These offerings were made by pilgrims who hoped for divine favor, a safe journey, a healed illness, a good harvest. Even the birds became part of the prayer, their wings folded with reverence and tucked beneath the earth. Egypt used clocks powered by sunlight and water long before mechanical time existed. Long before ticking gears and swinging pendulums, Egypt told time with light and water. Sundials were simple, a stick in the ground casting shadows. But they could be calibrated to tell hours, not just general shifts. Water clocks were more elegant, carefully shaped vessels that filled or emptied at steady rates, marked with lines to show the passage of time. These devices helped priests know when to perform rituals, when to open temple doors, when the stars would rise. Time in Egypt wasn't abstract. It flowed like the Nile, visible and sacred. And the tools they built to measure it were works of quiet genius. The capital city moved repeatedly, often to follow power, politics, or prophecy. Unlike modern nations with fixed capitals, ancient Egypt's seat of power shifted with the winds of dynasty and belief. Memphis, near the Nile Delta, was one of the earliest capitals, home to the first great kings. Thebes, farther south, rose to prominence in times of spiritual revival and military strength. Later came Akhetaten, a city built from nothing by a single pharaoh for a single god, and then abandoned like a dream. Even Alexandria, in Egypt's final chapter, served as a gleaming capital under Greek rule. Each move left behind monuments, memories, and mysteries. And each new center wasn't just a city, it was a statement about who ruled, what mattered, and what the gods had whispered next. One pharaoh tried to erase all other gods and nearly upended Egypt's entire religion. His name was Akhenaten, and his reign was unlike any other. He cast aside the powerful priesthoods, closed the temples, and declared that there was only one true god, the Aten, the sun disk. He moved the capital to a new city, Akhetaten, and filled its walls with images of sunlight, family, and devotion. The old gods, Amun, Osiris, Thoth, Hathor, were ignored or defaced. For nearly 2 decades, Egypt was a monotheistic kingdom. But after Akhenaten's death, everything changed. The old gods returned. His name was struck from monuments. His city crumbled. What remains is a haunting glimpse into a moment when belief itself cracked and then tried to mend. His son, Tutankhamun, became famous only because his tomb survived untouched. Tutankhamun was a boy king, ruling for less than 10 years and dying before adulthood. His reign might have been forgotten, overshadowed by larger-than-life pharaohs if not for one thing. His tomb was never looted. In 1922, archaeologist Howard Carter uncovered a sealed chamber in the Valley of the Kings. Inside were golden shrines, alabaster vases, chariots, statues, and a funerary mask of extraordinary beauty. For the first time, the modern world saw a royal burial as it had been, untouched, unspoiled, shimmering with ancient intention. Tutankhamun became a symbol not of power, but of preservation. A quiet king, remembered for what he left behind. When pyramids became too obvious to rob, pharaohs started hiding in cliffs. For centuries, pharaohs built pyramids, towering, unmistakable, and vulnerable. Over time, nearly all were broken into and looted. So later, dynasties changed their strategy. Instead of building upward, they buried deep. The Valley of the Kings became their silent cemetery, a series of hidden tombs carved into desert cliffs. From the surface, they're almost invisible. Inside, they're rich with color, filled with stars, spells, and golden treasures. This shift marked more than a change in architecture. It reflected a deepening of secrecy, a quiet turn inward. Egypt's kings were still reaching for eternity, but now they did it beneath the stone. A single broken stone, the Rosetta Stone, unlocked the voices of the ancient world. For centuries, no one could read hieroglyphs. The language of Egypt had fallen silent. But in 1799, near the town of Rosetta, soldiers discovered a slab of black granite inscribed with 3 languages: Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic. The same message repeated 3 times, a royal decree. Because Greek was still known, scholars could begin the long process of decoding the ancient script. It took decades, but eventually, the wall of silence cracked. Temples, tombs, and scrolls came alive again. The Rosetta Stone didn't just translate words. It gave voice to a civilization long buried in symbol and let it speak once more. Obelisks were stone needles meant to pierce the sky and anchor divine light. Rising like frozen rays of sunlight, obelisks stood at the entrances of temples, tall, narrow pillars carved from a single piece of stone. Their tips were often gilded, meant to catch the first light of dawn. Dedicated to the sun god Ra, they symbolized a cosmic connection, Earth reaching upward, light descending downward. Some weighed hundreds of tons and were transported over miles of desert. Others still stand today in Rome, Paris, London, far from their original homes. But each began as a sacred gesture, a monument not to kings or conquest, but to light itself and the invisible thread between gods and sky. Most Egyptians lived in homes made of sun-dried mud, designed to melt back into the earth. The pyramids were made of stone, but the homes of most Egyptians were made of something far more fragile: mud. Mixed with straw and shaped into bricks, this sun-dried material was cheap, abundant, and easy to build with. It kept the heat out during the day and stayed warm through the cool desert nights. But it wasn't made to last. Wind, flood, and time reduced these homes to dust. Entire towns disappeared, returning to the soil that had formed them. It was almost poetic, the houses of the living returning to the earth, while the tombs of the dead endured. In Egypt, permanence belonged to the afterlife. Life itself was always in motion. The floodwaters of the Nile created one of the most fertile strips of land on earth. Each year, the Nile would rise, a dark, rolling tide that swept across the banks and vanished into the waiting soil. When the water receded, it left behind a gift, a fine black silt, rich in nutrients. This natural fertilizer turned Egypt into a narrow green ribbon in the midst of endless desert. Wheat, flax, barley, figs, papyrus, they all thrived in this dark birth. The Egyptians didn't need complex irrigation or rotating fields. The river provided. It fed the people, the animals, and the gods. They called it Happy, a divine being of generosity and life. Without the flood, there would be no Egypt. With it came abundance. Ancient bread was filled with sand and slowly wore down people's teeth. Bread was the daily fuel of Egypt. Made from emmer wheat and ground with stone tools, it was baked in open ovens and eaten at every meal. But the grinding process often left behind tiny particles of grit and sand. Over time, these abrasive fragments wore down people's teeth, sometimes all the way to the root. Mummies from every class showed teeth cracked, flattened, or riddled with abscesses. Even pharaohs weren't spared. For all its richness, Egyptian cuisine had this hidden cost: a slow, steady erosion inside the mouth. A pain endured in silence, softened only by wine, beer, or the prayers of the gods. Egyptian perfume was so prized that recipes were guarded like royal secrets. The air of ancient Egypt was filled with scent, sacred incense in temples, fragrant oils in homes, and exotic perfumes on the skin of the elite. Perfume wasn't just beauty. It was medicine, ritual, and identity. Blends of myrrh, cinnamon, lily, and balsam were steeped in oil and aged like fine wine. Some formulas took weeks, others years. Certain temples had their own signature scents, used only in ceremonies. Royal recipes were considered so valuable they were sometimes hidden, destroyed, or lost forever. Even today, researchers have recreated some of them from ancient texts, and the fragrances still linger. A whisper from across the millennia. Magic wasn't superstition, it was a formal part of medicine and healing. In ancient Egypt, there was no divide between science and magic. The doctor might prescribe herbs, and also a spell. The priest might chant over the sick, while also applying poultices and oils. Healing was layered. The world, after all, was filled with forces both seen and unseen. Demons could cause illness. Spirits could block breath. Protection spells were written on amulets, recited at childbirth, painted on the walls of tombs. Far from irrational, this blend of belief and practice was deeply structured, documented, and taught. Magic wasn't superstition. It was one of the ways Egypt kept the balance between life and death. Scribes held so much status they were buried with their pens. To be a scribe in ancient Egypt was to hold the power of language, law, and legacy. These were not mere record keepers, they were masters of sacred symbols, trusted by kings and priests alike. In a land where writing was seen as divine, the scribe was a bridge between mortals and the gods. They documented offerings, measured harvests, composed hymns, and recorded spells for the dead. Their skill brought prestige, stability, and sometimes immortality. So revered were they that many were buried with their writing kits, ink palettes, red pens, and scrolls, tools not just for this life, but for the next. A soul who could write, after all, could remember its name and write itself back into being. The reed pen was more than a tool. It was a sacred link to Thoth, the god of writing. Egyptian scribes didn't use quills or brushes. They wrote with simple, elegant reed pens, trimmed to a fine point, dipped in ink made from soot or ochre, and drawn across papyrus with practiced care. But these weren't just tools. Each stroke was a ritual, each glyph a living breath of the divine. The god Thoth, often shown with the head of an ibis, was said to have invented writing itself. Every mark made with a reed pen was an echo of that divine act, shaping order from chaos, memory from silence. To write was to invoke Thoth, and to hold a pen was to hold a sliver of sacred power. Music was more than entertainment. It was a form of worship that echoed in temple halls. In the temples of Egypt, music didn't entertain, it elevated. Flutes, harps, tambourines, and sistrums, rattles sacred to the goddess Hathor, filled the air with rhythm and reverence. Musicians accompanied sacred rituals, processions, and offerings. The vibrations were thought to please the gods, stir divine presence, and help maintain Ma'at, the cosmic balance. Even household shrines had music. It lulled the soul, summoned protection, and marked the cycle of life. In hieroglyphs, we see women shaking sistrums in long rows, not performers, but priestesses. Their music wasn't for an audience. It was for the unseen, for the world behind the veil. Every household had a god, and most had a personal shrine to speak with them. Religion in ancient Egypt wasn't confined to temples. It lived in every home, woven into daily life. Most families had a small shrine, a simple niche, a painted box, a stone tucked into a wall where offerings could be made and prayers whispered. These domestic gods were close and personal, protective cobras, fertility spirits, guardian dwarves like Bes, or lioness mothers like Taweret. They watched over childbirth, health, sleep, and safety. Bread, beer, or flowers might be left at night. A candle lit in gratitude. In a world of grand temples and distant pharaohs, the home shrine was something intimate, a quiet promise that the divine was never far. The Eye of Horus was more than a symbol. It was worn as protection against chaos itself. The Eye of Horus, with its curled markings and sharp lines, is among the most iconic symbols of ancient Egypt. But it wasn't just decorative. It was protective. Rooted in myth, the eye was torn out during Horus's battle with Set and then magically restored. That healing gave it power. It came to represent wholeness, clarity, and the strength to survive wounds, both physical and spiritual. Amulets shaped like the eye were worn by the living and placed on the dead. Sailors painted it on boats. Mothers hung it above cradles. It wasn't a lucky charm. It was a shield, a spell carved in the shape of sight. Pharaohs didn't just lead, they marched at the front of armies into battle. We often picture pharaohs as distant rulers, seated on thrones, weighed down by gold. But in times of war, they rode at the front. Ramses II charged into battle at Kadesh, his chariot slicing through chaos. Thutmose III led dozens of campaigns, his military strategy unmatched. These kings weren't figureheads. They were commanders, expected to lead by divine right and personal bravery. Victory in battle affirmed their favor with the gods. Defeat risked the unraveling of order itself. And so, beneath the royal crowns and ceremonial titles was a warrior, riding into dust, drawn bow in hand, the fate of Egypt hanging in his wake. Some tomb ceilings were painted with stars, so the dead could sleep beneath the night sky forever. Step into the tomb of a noble or pharaoh, and you might look up to see stars, thousands of them, painted in vivid white against deep blue. These weren't decorative. They were a portal. Egyptians believed the afterlife was a mirror of the sky, and that the soul would travel among the stars in the company of gods. Painting the tomb ceiling as a celestial canopy meant the dead would never be trapped underground. They would rest beneath the heavens, bathed in starlight. Some ceilings even mapped constellations and lunar cycles, not just a sky to admire, but a map to follow. A tomb wasn't just a resting place. It was a starship for the soul. Gold was mined deep in the eastern desert, guarded by sacred texts and dangerous spirits. Egypt's gold didn't come from the Nile. It came from the scorching deserts to the east. Mines were carved into mountainsides under the blazing sun, worked by laborers who knew both danger and devotion. Ancient texts record the routes, guarded by gods and curses alike. Some inscriptions invoke divine protection for the miners. Others warn intruders to turn back or face the wrath of spirits. Gold was not merely wealth, it was flesh of the gods. Sacred, radiant, eternal. To extract it was to walk the edge between fortune and blasphemy. The desert didn't give up its treasure easily. But for those who braved it, the reward glittered like sunlight trapped in stone. Internal organs weren't discarded. They were stored in jars under divine protection. In the mummification process, the body had to be emptied but never desecrated. The lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines were carefully removed, embalmed, and placed in canopic jars. Each jar bore the head of one of the 4 sons of Horus, divine guardians assigned to protect each organ. The liver went to Imseti, the lungs to Hapi, the stomach to Duamutef, the intestines to Kebasenuf. These jars were placed near the body, often inside carved chests, and sealed with prayers. The heart, the seat of the soul, was usually left inside, or wrapped separately. The body may have been divided, but nothing was lost. Everything sacred remained under watch. Linen wrappings often contained dozens of hidden amulets, each with a purpose. The mummy's wrappings weren't just layers of cloth, they were layers of magic. Hidden within the folds were amulets, tiny carved charms made of gold, faience, stone, or glass. Each had its own purpose. An eye of Horus to heal, a scarab to grant rebirth, a GED pillar for stability, a knot of Isis for protection. These charms were placed at precise locations on the body, the throat, the chest, the fingers, guided by ritual texts. Some mummies had dozens. Royal ones had hundreds. The wrappings became a woven armor of spells and symbols. A body shielded not just in cloth, but in sacred meaning, wrapped tightly in hope. Your soul couldn't rest until your heart was weighed against a feather. In the Hall of Judgment, every Egyptian soul faced a test. The god Anubis would place the person's heart, the seat of truth and memory, on a scale. On the other side sat a feather. Not just any feather, the feather of Ma'at, goddess of balance and cosmic order. If the heart was lighter than the feather, the soul could enter the afterlife. If heavier, it was devoured by a demon called Amit, and the soul ceased to exist. There was no punishment, no fire, just final erasure. It wasn't about crime, but harmony. To pass the test, your life had to be in balance, light, honest, remembered with love. Sacred texts were written in two colors, black for words, red for spells and danger. On Egyptian papyrus scrolls, color wasn't decoration, it was code. Most of the text was written in black ink, made from carbon soot. But red ink marked power. It was used to highlight divine names, magical words, chapter titles, or warnings. Sometimes it introduced dangerous spirits or pivotal actions in spells. To the Egyptians, red was the color of energy, life, and risk, associated with both vitality and chaos. Reading it was like walking a line between worlds. The Book of the Dead, full of these dual-colored lines, wasn't just read. It was followed, like a map through shadows, where the ink itself whispered what was sacred and what was perilous. The cobra and vulture weren't decorations. They were protective forces coiled on the pharaoh's brow. The pharaoh's crown was more than a symbol of power. It was a living invocation. On its front, you'd find two creatures, a cobra and a vulture, poised and alert. The cobra, known as the Urius, represented the goddess Washet, guardian of Lower Egypt. The vulture stood for Nekhbet, protector of Upper Egypt. Together, they fused divine rule with earthly geography. But these weren't just emblems of unity. They were magical sentinels. The cobra was said to spit fire at enemies. The vulture spread invisible wings of protection. Every time the pharaoh wore the crown, he wasn't just ruling. He was calling down guardians with fangs and feathers, watching from his brow. Some temples were carved straight into cliffs and lit so the gods would awaken with the sun. Not all temples rose from stone. Some were hewn into it. Abu Simbel, perhaps the most famous, was carved directly into a sandstone cliff by Ramses II. Its colossal statues gaze out across the Nile. But inside lies the true magic. The temple's inner sanctuary is aligned so that twice a year, on or near the king's birthday and coronation day, the rising sun pierces deep into the heart of the temple, illuminating statues of the gods and Ramses himself. These were not accidents. They were cosmic blueprints, etched in stone. The gods weren't just housed, they were awakened by light. Giant statues weren't just decoration. They were guardians between the world of men and gods. Towering above temple gates, lining avenues, flanking thrones, Egypt's colossal statues are unforgettable. But they weren't built just to impress. They were watchers, guardians, sacred forms meant to contain divine presence. A statue of a pharaoh didn't just show his image, it became a vessel for his ka, his spiritual essence. The same was true for gods. Rituals called the spirit into the stone. Offerings were made. Incense burned. The statue saw and heard. Even after death, a king could receive tribute through his statue. They were more than stone. They were awake, silent, seated, and powerful. Ancient graffiti survives in tombs, messages left by workers, pilgrims, and even pranksters. Amid the sacred texts and carved prayers of Egypt's tombs, you'll sometimes find something unexpected: graffiti. Not vandalism as we think of it, but messages left by ordinary people. Workers etched their names into stones they helped place. Pilgrims scribbled blessings, prayers, or dedications. One reads, "I was here with my friend." Another simply names a dog. Some graffiti is teasing, humorous, even rebellious. It reminds us that Egypt wasn't just a land of priests and kings. It was full of people with sharp tools and things to say. Across millennia, their voices still echo, rough, playful, and unmistakably human. The desert could naturally mummify a body, preserving it for thousands of years without rituals. Before embalming became an art, nature did the work. In Egypt's dry, sandy deserts, bodies buried shallowly in the ground would dehydrate quickly, preventing rot and preserving skin, hair, and even fingerprints. These were the first mummies, unplanned, untouched by priests, but astonishingly intact. Some are over 5,000 years old and still show signs of life, tattoos, clothing, ornaments. It was likely this accidental preservation that inspired the Egyptians to develop intentional mummification. The desert taught them a lesson, that the body, if cared for, could remain almost forever. All it needed was silence, sand, and time. One sacred beetle, the dumb-rolling scarab, was believed to push the sun across the sky. To the ancient Egyptians, the lowly scarab beetle wasn't a pest. It was a divine symbol of rebirth. They watched it roll balls of dung across the ground and saw in that act something cosmic, the image of the sun god Khepri, who rolled the sun through the sky each morning. The beetle became a sacred image of the daily cycle of renewal, transformation, and resurrection. Scarab amulets were carved in the thousands, buried with the dead, stamped into seals, worn as protection. In a world of crocodiles and falcons, it was a beetle that moved the heavens, quietly, persistently, every day. The lotus flower wasn't just beautiful, it bloomed from the mud and symbolized rebirth. In the still waters of Egypt, something miraculous unfolded each morning, the lotus. Rising from dark, muddy depths, it opened with the dawn, spreading its pale petals to greet the sun. Then, as the light faded, it closed and sank again into the water, only to rise once more. To the ancient Egyptians, this was not just a plant. It was a message, a symbol of rebirth, of the soul's daily return from darkness. The lotus became a motif of creation, resurrection, and divine awakening. Gods were shown sitting on lotus thrones. The dead were buried with lotus garlands, a flower that bloomed from mud and reached for the sky. Some gods were worshipped only in one town, and their names vanished with it. Not every god of Egypt was famous. Some were local, known only in a single town or village, their temples small but sacred. These deities were guardians of wells, fields, or markets, protectors of a single place. When the towns fell, the gods often disappeared too. Their names were never written in national myths. Their faces weren't preserved in great carvings. But once, they were real, whispered to in candlelight, called upon in childbirth, honored with songs now lost. Archaeologists sometimes uncover statues with unfamiliar names, gods with no surviving stories. Echoes of faith that flickered, flared, and quietly vanished. The world's oldest woven dress was found in an Egyptian tomb, nearly 5,000 years old. Hidden in a grave near the Nile, archaeologists discovered a treasure not of gold, but of fabric, the Tarkan dress, the oldest known woven garment in the world. Made of linen and dated to around 3480 BCE, it still shows finely pleated sleeves and a carefully tailored cut, evidence of skilled craftsmanship and style long before history's breath. First fashion magazines. The dress was simple but elegant. It was buried not as wealth, but as memory. perhaps once worn, perhaps treasured. And somehow, across 5 millennia, it survived, folded quietly in the dark, waiting to be remembered. Priests watched the stars to know when to plant, when to pray, and when to speak to the dead. Egyptian priests weren't just ritual leaders, they were astronomers. They studied the sky, noting the rising and setting of stars to mark the rhythm of life. The star Sirius signaled the annual flooding of the Nile, the moment when fields would boom again. Other constellations guided holy festivals, temple ceremonies, and even the opening of tombs. Observing the heavens wasn't science or superstition. It was communion. The stars were gods. The sky was sacred text. And by reading its patterns, priests synchronized Earth with eternity, bringing harvest, healing, and harmony between above and below. Mirrors were made of polished bronze and used in rituals to reflect the soul. Before glass, the people of Egypt gazed at themselves in bronze. Polished to a shine, these mirrors shimmered like liquid light, often round, sometimes engraved, and always carried with care. But they weren't just for vanity. Mirrors were believed to reflect the ka, the spiritual essence of a person. They were used in funerary rites, magical workings, and beauty rituals alike. Some were buried with the dead, meant to help the soul recognize itself in the afterlife. In myth, the goddess Hathor looked into a mirror to restore her divine form, a simple tool that revealed the self beyond the body. Nile crocodiles were both feared and fed. Some were kept in temple pools and worshipped as gods. To live near the Nile was to live near crocodiles, silent, sudden, and deadly. But the Egyptians didn't just fear them, they worshipped them. The crocodile god Sobek represented strength, fertility, and protection. In some towns, live crocodiles were kept in temple pools, adorned with jewelry and fed by priests. When they died, they were mummified with reverence, wrapped, embalmed, and placed in sacred tombs. To honor the predator was to tame it, to fold its fury into order. Sobek was both danger and shield, a god who lurked in still water, sharp-toothed and sacred. Gods could merge into each other, forming new deities with combined powers and forms. In ancient Egypt, the divine was fluid. Gods didn't stay confined to one form or name. They could merge, two beings blending into one, not erasing each other, but amplifying their essence. Amun-Ra, the hidden wind and the radiant sun, became king of the gods. Osiris fused creator, guardian, and lord of the dead. These weren't contradictions. They were expressions of divine complexity, layers upon layers, like colors mixing on a sacred palette. When gods combined, they became more mysterious and more complete. In Egypt, the truth was rarely singular. It shimmered, shifted, and wore many faces. Some tombs had curses inscribed to terrify thieves. Real or not, they worked. Cursed be he who disturbs this tomb, some inscriptions warn. May his limbs tremble, and his soul never rest. These weren't idle threats. Tomb robbing was a real danger, and so tomb builders sometimes left dire warnings, curses invoking gods, plagues, madness, or divine punishment. Were they magical? Possibly. Psychological? Absolutely. Even centuries later, when archaeologists opened sealed chambers, stories of curses lingered, mysterious deaths, strange coincidences. Truth or not, the idea worked. A few well-placed words could make even the boldest thief hesitate and wonder who, or what, might be watching from the dark. Beloved cats, dogs, monkeys, and even gazelles were sometimes mummified and buried with their owners. Pets in ancient Egypt weren't just animals. They were family, companions, sometimes even sacred symbols. Cats were protectors of the home, linked to Bastet. Dogs guarded both house and tomb. Some families loved their animals so deeply, they buried them in tiny coffins beside their owners. These weren't just bones wrapped in cloth. Many were fully mummified, with care and reverence. In one tomb, a monkey was found wearing a collar. In another, a gazelle lay at rest beside its mistress. Death didn't mean separation. For some Egyptians, eternity would feel more like home if it included a purring friend. Boats were sacred. They ferried the dead through the underworld and the sun through the sky. The Nile gave Egypt life and shaped its spirituality. Boats weren't just practical, they were divine vehicles. In myth, the sun god Ra traveled through the sky by boat during the day and through the underworld by night, battling darkness, then rising again. In funerary beliefs, the dead also needed a boat to reach the afterlife. Models of boats were buried in tombs. Full-sized vessels were sometimes sealed beside pyramids. The journey to the next world wasn't walked, it was sailed. The river taught them this. A body on the Nile, a soul on its way. Egyptian ships sailed beyond the Red Sea, trading with places still unknown. Egypt was not isolated. Its ships ventured far, down the Red Sea, into the lands of Punt, and perhaps even further. The land of Punt, often called God's land, was rich in incense, gold, ebony, and exotic animals. Pharaohs like Hatshepsut sent fleets there, returning with treasures and tales. But where exactly was Punt? Somalia? Yemen? Somewhere lost beneath desert or sea? We still don't know. The routes were kept secret, protected by myth and mystery. But the images on temple walls show longboats, strange creatures, and foreign faces, proof that Egypt looked outward, always searching, always trading, even with lands the modern world has yet to rediscover. Entire temples were dismantled and moved stone by stone to save them from rising waters. In the 1960s, a modern miracle occurred. As Egypt built the Aswan High Dam, rising waters from Lake Nasser threatened to drown ancient sites, including the great temples of Abu Simbel. But the world responded. Teams of archaeologists and engineers carefully cut the temples into blocks, moved them uphill, and reassembled them precisely as they were, preserving their sacred alignments with the sun. It was one of the largest heritage rescues in history, a feat of reverence and precision, spanning nations and decades. The temples still stand today, not quite where they were, but still gazing at the dawn, as they always have. Mummification took 70 days, and each step had a spell or ceremony. To preserve a body in ancient Egypt wasn't a quick task. It took 70 days, each filled with rituals, drying, wrapping, and sacred recitations. The process began with purification, the body washed in palm wine and Nile water. Then came the removal of organs, careful drying with natron salts, and the anointing with oils and resins. Wrapping took weeks, and each layer of linen might be accompanied by a spell, an amulet, or a name whispered for remembrance. The embalmers weren't just technicians, they were ritual specialists guiding the soul through transformation. Mummification wasn't preservation. It was rebirth in sacred time. Some pharaohs were intentionally erased, their names chiseled out of every monument. In Egypt, to lose your name was to lose your soul. So the punishment of damnatio memoriae, the deliberate erasure of a ruler's identity, was profound. Hatshepsut, a powerful female pharaoh, was nearly wiped from history. Akhenaten, the heretic king who worshipped one god, had his name and temples defaced after death. In many cases, chisels scratched names from stone, broke statues' faces, or recarved them for later kings. It wasn't just political, it was spiritual warfare. To erase a name was to steal its place in eternity. Yet many of these erased souls still speak to us today. The jackal-headed god Anubis guarded cemeteries and greeted souls at the edge of death. Black-furred and silent, Anubis walked the edge between the living and the dead. With the head of a jackal, a scavenger of graveyards, he became the protector of tombs, the guardian of embalming, and the first guide to the afterlife. In early myth, Anubis weighed the heart of the dead against the feather of truth. He bound the body in linen, watched over the necropolis, and ensured that every soul found its path. His presence was solemn, shadowed, but never cruel. To the ancient Egyptians, death wasn't a terror. It was a transition, and Anubis was there to walk it with you. Tomb carvings weren't bare stone. They were once painted in vibrant colors. Walk through an Egyptian tomb today, and the carvings may seem soft and pale, faded over time. But once, those scenes blazed with color. Blues and reds, deep ochres, vivid greens. Gods stood in radiant golds. Farmers walked through fields of emerald barley. The sky was painted with stars, the Nile with lapis fish. Paint was not just art, it gave life to stone. In some places, flecks of color still cling to the walls, whispering how alive these chambers once felt. To carve was to shape the body. To paint was to give it a soul. Hatshepsut built a temple so magnificent it was carved straight into living cliff. Pharaoh Hatshepsut, one of the few women to rule Egypt in her own right, left behind a masterpiece, Der el-Bahari. Her mortuary temple rises from the desert floor in symmetrical terraces, hugging the cliffs like an extension of the mountain itself. It was designed not just for beauty, but to mirror the natural world, where stone meets sunlight and earth breathes sky. Inside, colonnades tell stories of her divine birth and trading expeditions to distant lands. The temple wasn't just for worship. It was a legacy carved into the bones of the earth, and a woman's voice made unerasable. Ancient jewelry mixed gold with colored glass to mimic the colors of the gods. Jewelry in ancient Egypt was far more than adornment. It was protection, symbolism, and beauty, all crafted with precision and meaning. Gold was prized not only for its value, but because it symbolized eternity, the skin of the gods. But even humble pieces shimmered with color. Artisans blended gold with pharaohs, a type of glazed ceramic, and with colored glass to mimic lapis lazuli, turquoise, and carnelian, materials associated with divine power. Each hue carried a message: blue for the heavens, red for vitality, green for life. Jewelry was more than sparkle. It was magic you could wear. Statues were awakened with ritual, so the soul of the deity could inhabit the stone. To the ancient Egyptians, a statue wasn't just an image, it could become alive. Through a sacred ritual called the opening of the mouth, priests would symbolically open the statue's senses. Its eyes to see, its ears to hear, its mouth to breathe and speak. Incense swirled, chants rose, and the spirit of the god was invited to enter the stone. From that moment on, the statue wasn't just a symbol, it was the presence of the deity. Offerings were placed before it. Secrets were whispered to it. And when the ritual was complete, the god was there, listening in silence, Thoth, the Ibish-headed god, was believed to have invented writing, time, and the very laws of the universe. With the head of an ibis and the scroll of destiny in his hand, Thoth was the architect of order. He invented writing so the deeds of gods and men could be remembered. He measured the heavens and gave Egypt its calendar. He even settled disputes between gods, weighing truth with impartial wisdom. In myth, Thoth recorded the results of the final judgment, inscribing each soul's fate. He wasn't a warrior or a builder. He was the voice of reason, logic, and memory. Every scroll, every formula, every line of hieroglyphs was, in a way, a whisper from Thoth. The crook and flail weren't just symbols. They meant the pharaoh must both protect and punish. Held across the chest of statues and sarcophagi, the crook and flail are instantly recognizable. But they weren't random emblems. The crook was the shepherd's tool, a sign that the pharaoh must guide and protect his people. The flail was for threshing grain and also for discipline. Together, they represented the balance every ruler must strike: kindness and command, mercy and might. These tools weren't weapons, but warnings. The pharaoh was not just a king. He was a shepherd with a staff and a god with a lash. Some pyramids collapsed mid-construction, and the mistakes were buried beneath new ones. Not every pyramid was a success. One of the earliest, the Maiden Pyramid, partially collapsed, leaving behind a strange stepped ruin. The famous bent pyramid began to crack midway through building, forcing the angle to be changed abruptly. Even the ancient engineers, as skilled as they were, made catastrophic errors, sometimes because of haste, bad stone, or ambition outpacing physics. But rather than abandon the dream, they adjusted. They built again, sometimes right over the broken remains. Egypt's monuments weren't born perfect. They were shaped through risk, failure, and an unshakable desire to reach the sky. The Red Land was the desert of chaos. The Black Land was the life-giving strip beside the Nile. To the Egyptians, the landscape itself was spiritual. The Black Land, or Kemet, was the fertile strip along the Nile, dark with rich silt, alive with crops and people. But beyond it lay the Red Land, or Deshret, a world of burning sun, dry rock, and chaos. The desert wasn't just wilderness, it was the domain of Set, god of disorder and storms. Yet Egypt existed because of the tension between these two forces, the balance of life and danger, harvest and hunger. Civilization grew in the slender space where order held the line against chaos. Egypt was conquered again and again, but its culture bent without breaking. Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, across the centuries, Egypt was conquered many times. But unlike many fallen civilizations, its identity endured. New rulers adopted Egyptian customs, rebuilt temples, and tried to claim pharaonic titles. The gods were renamed, but still worshipped. The art changed subtly, not suddenly. Even under Rome, hieroglyphs were carved and mummies buried in ancient fashion. Egypt absorbed invaders the way the Nile absorbed its banks, slowly, steadily, without losing itself. It wasn't defiance. It was continuity. The pyramids watched it all, unmoved. Egypt didn't fall. It flowed. Even the humblest graves often contained amulets, because no soul should enter the afterlife unprotected. Not everyone could afford a pyramid or elaborate tomb. Most Egyptians were buried in simple pits or modest chapels. Yet even in these quiet resting places, you'll often find amulets, tiny charms of pharaohs or stone shaped like scarabs, eyes, ankhs, or tiny gods. They were placed in wrappings, laid on chests, tucked beneath arms. They weren't just for comfort. They were spells made solid, meant to guide, guard, and empower the soul on its journey. Rich or poor, known or forgotten, no one was meant to walk into the next world alone. Every soul deserved a little magic. The last known hieroglyphs were carved in 394 CE, just before the old temples fell silent. Somewhere in the temple of Philae, a priest picked up his chisel for the final time. He carved a line of hieroglyphs, invoking a ritual in the language of gods. It was 394 CE. Soon after, the temple would be shuttered by decree, and the ancient scripts would fall silent, unread, unwritten, slowly forgotten. For over 3,000 years, hieroglyphs had recorded births and battles, prayers and poetry. Then, they vanished, until the Rosetta Stone cracked their code centuries later. That final line at Philae wasn't just a text. It was the last breath of an old world, etched in stone before the light went out. The Great Pyramid once gleamed white, covered in polished limestone casing stones. Today, the Great Pyramid of Giza rises in golden stone, worn by wind and time. But when it was newly built, it looked completely different. Its surface was covered in smooth white Tura limestone, polished to a high gleam that reflected sunlight like a beacon. It must have shimmered against the blue sky, a mountain of light, dazzling across the desert. Some ancient writers said it could be seen from miles away. Over the centuries, most of that casing stone was stripped for later buildings. But for a long time, the Great Pyramid wasn't just tall. It shone like a star on Earth. Some gods had dozens of names, faces, and forms, yet were always the same presence. In ancient Egypt, a god could be a lion, a falcon, a sun, a sound, a color, a moment of time. Gods like Ra had dozens of names, each reflecting a role: Ra-Horafti, Otonra, Ra of the horizon. Isis could be a mother, a throne, a sky, or even a hidden word. This wasn't confusion. It was depth. The Egyptians didn't believe in one face of the divine. They believed in many faces, one essence. To speak a god's name was to summon one part of a mystery. The more names a deity had, the more real it was. Temples smelled of incense and echoed with chants, creating a sensory world for the divine. Temples weren't quiet stone halls. They were alive, humming with ritual, color, scent, and sound. Priests chanted hymns in rhythm. Incense, frankincense, myrrh, kyphi filled the air with sweetness and smoke. Walls were painted in vibrant reds and blues. Offerings of bread, flowers, and wine were arranged like art. Each temple was a miniature cosmos, designed to attract and house the gods, to delight the senses and signal reverence. To walk through one was to step into a holy performance, not just for humans, but for the unseen. The gods, it was believed, responded to beauty. Many Egyptian myths were never written, only whispered, generation to generation. Despite the thousands of inscriptions, papyri, and temple carvings, many of Egypt's stories were never recorded. They lived in the voices of storytellers, passed from mother to child, priest to novice, worker to worker. Some myths survive only in hints, fragments, or echoes. Names without tales. Symbols without context. Entire cosmologies may have vanished the moment the last teller fell silent. And yet, they shaped the world all the same. Egypt's memory wasn't all stone and scroll. Some of it was breath, warm, fleeting, and gone like smoke on desert wind. Greek and Roman religions absorbed Egypt's gods and carried them westward across centuries. When Greece and Rome came to Egypt, they didn't destroy its gods, they adopted them. Isis became a goddess of the empire, worshipped from Spain to Syria. Serapis, a blend of Osiris and Greek deities, was created to bridge cultures. Statues of Horus stood in Roman villas. Egyptian symbols, ankhs, scarabs, and the Eye of Horus were etched into jewelry, mosaics, and temples far from the Nile. The gods changed names, took new forms, and kept traveling. Long after pharaohs faded, Egypt's mythology still pulsed through Western belief. The river of myth had changed course, but it kept flowing. Some tombs lay hidden for thousands of years, undisturbed beneath the shifting sand. Not all tombs were looted. Some were forgotten entirely, covered by sandstorms, built over by new cities, or buried so deep no one knew they were there. These sealed chambers remained untouched for millennia, filled with treasures, scrolls, bodies still wrapped in linen. When discovered, they brought the past to life with stunning clarity. Tutankhamun's tomb, discovered in 1922, had been hidden for over 3,000 years. Other tombs are still being found, with names we've never seen and gods we barely recognize. In Egypt, memory can sleep beneath your feet, undisturbed, until the wind shifts. Much of what we know came not from monuments, but from fragments, shopping lists, love letters, and laundry marks. The pyramids told us what Egypt built, but scraps of papyrus told us how Egypt lived. A woman's note to her son, urging him to behave. A laundry list from a priest. A spell scratched onto the back of a pot. Love poems tucked into tombs. These humble personal relics, never meant to last, survived by chance. They reveal voices not of kings or gods, but of people, tired, tender, curious, flawed, the everyday breath of an ancient world. Egypt wasn't just golden tombs. It was messy homes, sweethearts, chores, and dreams scrawled in ink, now faded by time. Even today, Egyptian ruins are still being discovered, entire cities sleeping beneath the soil. Every year, the desert gives up more secrets. Beneath shifting sand, in shadowed cliffs, and under the silt of vanished rivers, lie entire cities. Some are known only from whispers in texts. Others appear suddenly when construction crews dig too deep. Tombs with painted walls, workshops filled with tools, statues still standing where priests once walked. Egypt is not a finished story. It is still unfolding, still speaking. Archaeologists today uncover the same wonders that stunned visitors 4,000 years ago. The past isn't buried, it's waiting. The story of ancient Egypt didn't end, it became part of the world's dream. Though the temples fell silent and the gods faded into myth, Egypt never truly vanished. It lived on in scrolls, in legends, in distant cathedrals and modern cities. The pyramids became symbols. The Nile became a metaphor. Its gods walked into our languages, our dreams, our stars. Children still learn their names. Artists still paint their faces. And as long as someone wonders what lies beneath the sand, or looks up at a sky once watched by a scribe with an inked reed in hand, Egypt lives. Not just in memory, in imagination. And now, let the echoes of Egypt fade into stillness. The golden temples, the whispering tombs, the gods with many faces, all dissolving like sand through fingers, soft and silent beneath the stars. You've wandered through a world older than memory, where the sky told stories, and the Nile flowed not just through fields, but through the hearts of a people who dreamed of eternity. Perhaps you'll carry something with you into sleep tonight, the gleam of a pyramid under moonlight, a scarab pushing the sun across the sky, or a name whispered into the desert wind, still waiting to be remembered. Here, in this place between waking and dreaming, you are not far from those ancient souls. You are lying beneath the same stars. You are breathing the same mystery. So close your eyes now. Let the gods stand guard at the gates of your rest. Let the stories fold around you like linen, soft, sacred, and spun with care. If you happen to still be awake, here's another gentle reminder to like and subscribe for more videos like this every day. And feel free to watch the next one on the screen if you're still feeling curious. But if you're ready to drift, then may your dreams be long and filled with wonder.